A young, wealthy boy sat on a pier, twiddling his thumbs and laughing at all the poor fishermen who had to work tirelessly just to put food on the table. "Ha!" he jeered. "You fools! My father's money far surpasses your meager earnings for a fraction of the work." An older fellow sat next to the boy, silently offering a bite from his bowl of homegrown beans. "What is this, old man?" the boy asked incredulously. "You think you are rich or important enough to sit next to me?" The man looked at the boy for a moment, contemplating his words, before finally speaking. In a gravelly voice that spoke with the wisdom of generations that came before, he said, "Wait, isn't this a politics channel? So Terraria freaking rocks, right? It was pure luck that it ever found its way into my life. My mother owned a Kindle Fire and bought the game on a whim when it was on sale, and, well, the rest is history. I have the distinct advantage of having played at an age where I didn't have immediate access to the wikis and fan forums, meaning I pretty much had to find everything out for myself. Some folks criticize Terraria for being a game that requires the player to pore over wiki pages in order to play it, and those folks are wrong. Sure, if you want to play the game with maximum effectiveness, you can find thousands of tips and tricks online, but trial and error will work just fine if you're hoping to beat the game for the first time. I didn't take weeks to beat Plantera for the first time because Terraria is confusing. I took weeks because I was a dumb little baby child who didn't have the patience to dig a hole in the ground. For the most part, I think Terraria progression works nicely. There are so many powerful items and weapons that you're bound to find at least a few, and permanent advancements like heart and mana crystals, shadow orbs, boss summons, NPC houses, etc. are all pretty easy to stumble upon within a reasonable amount of time without too much reliance on the guide. The critiques I'll be making today specifically refer to exploits and progression-breaking tools that the devs have retroactively altered in recent years. It's inevitable that these sorts of things are going to happen as the community is going to use various mechanics in ways that you as a developer didn't expect them to, leading to players engaging with the game well outside of the desired boundaries. An obvious example of this is the Reaver Shark, a pickaxe that can be fished from the ocean biome that once upon a time would allow the player to skip half the game's pickaxe progression entirely. I imagine that the Reaver Shark was implemented as a little surprise reward, a tool that could be obtained if a lucky player fished in the right place. The problem arose when the entire community began using the Reaver Shark as a means of completely altering the flow of gameplay. Suddenly, pickaxe progression no longer mattered. Why go through the effort of defeating evil bosses to obtain a pickaxe powerful enough to dig up ores from hell when you can just run to the ocean, ignore a drowning child, and get a stronger pickaxe in minutes? The devs were absolutely right to nerf the Reaver Shark, even if it's a little sad that such an iconic tool is no longer overpowered. The 1.4 updates in particular have sought to fix many similar issues, working to balance the game and better outline the process of getting from point A, getting murked by slimes, to point B, killing God himself. This video will cover a few such fixes, why I think they're not conducive to new players, and mostly how I'd fix them. I think that's all my preamble, so let's just get right into it. The Jungle Temple is far from my favorite structure in the game. How could it be when the dungeon is literally right there? But still, one thing that makes the Jungle Temple exciting is its unique assortment of traps, ranging from spears, darts, and flamethrowers to wooden spikes on the ground and ceiling for some reason. At the end of the Jungle Temple, you are tasked with fighting Golem, considered by the community to be the hardest boss in the game. Battling this rock monster in a cramped space while avoiding traps and dodging enemies gives the journey and eventual boss fight a certain flavor to it. At least, it would if players weren't able to come straight in and cut all the wires in the structure and to make every trap useless. Removing the ability to see and cut wires in the temple was a no-brainer. Unfortunately, its implementation wasn't all that perfect. As of 1.4.4, the player can no longer interact in any way with temple wires until Golem is defeated. This doesn't perfectly avert the aforementioned problems, but I don't expect them to make traps in the temple literally unavoidable. Actually, I do. I'll explain in a minute. As a player who started out using trial and error, this is frustrating because someone who tries to cut the wires pre-Golem is likely to realize they aren't able to and never try again. The game gives no clear indication that something has changed, such as how the message screams are echoing from the dungeon appears after defeating Plantera, enticing the player to return and investigate what's happened. As it stands, you're likely to just assume that there are no wires in the Jungle Temple and leave it at that. Now, I'm not suggesting the game give a message to inform you that you can now cut temple wires. My ideal solution would look roughly like this. If you use any item designed to allow you to see wires pre-Golem, the Jungle Temple would appear blurred or warped in some way, as though something is magically shrouding it from view. This would immediately tip off the player that something's abnormal about this place. From there, defeating Golem would either drop an item, consumable or otherwise, that allows the player to see temple wires, or the game could be left as is, leaving the player to test whether they've broken that weird enchantment they saw earlier. There are probably other ways to do this, but those are the ideas that I've brainstormed, informed. It's possible that the game lets you know about this in some niche way, but I haven't been able to find it, so the critique still stands. As an aside, if the goal is still to make Golem harder, it'd be interesting if you were able to use traps himself, like if they would automatically activate during the fight. This could lead to an interesting trade-off where if the player wants to avoid the traps, they'd have to artificially shrink their arena. If this has been considered but rejected, I'm definitely curious as to why that might be. My second example is pretty similar, though my solution is a tad different. Meteorites are a cool random event that occur periodically after certain conditions are met. Mechanistically, I think this is fantastic. It's such a cool way to deliver a new ore to the world that I still remember the excitement when I first found one. Meteorites are somewhat dangerous, though, setting the player on fire and spawning floating monsters. Because of this, players used to avoid mining them altogether, instead opting to throw bombs or dynamite at them to break them from a distance. As of 1.4.1, explosives no longer destroy meteorite until after a boss, the Wall of Flesh, is defeated. This forces the player to physically mine meteorites up close and deal with the dangers directly. That's great, but again, I wonder why a player would think that their bombs have magically gotten more powerful just because they defeated the world's guardian. In this case, I think the solution is simple. Just keep bombs and dynamite unable to destroy meteorite for the whole game, and make all post-wall explosives capable of breaking it. If you're married to the idea of bombs and dynamites being able to break meteorite, then make a hard mode variant of them with the same explosive radius but more power. This wouldn't make the earlier explosives that you've collected along your playthrough obsolete, but it would give an intuitive way to break meteorite and some other explosion-resistant blocks. On a minor note, this is an older decision, but it's relevant to me nonetheless. Wings are a really useful accessory, but the game doesn't really make it clear that some wings are better than others until much later in progression. On my first playthrough, I just found a pair of wings and stuck with them until I could find a hoverboard, back when you couldn't even use a hoverboard properly on mobile. I feel like it'd be kind of helpful if they gave some indication of how powerful wings were so you could see the benefit of crafting newer ones. Fledgling wings kind of imply this by being incredibly weak, suggesting that future wings will be stronger, but those are also rare and not a perfect solution by any means. This isn't something that desperately needs changing, but I don't know, I think it'd be worth considering. Our next critique is a combination of a variety of changes, some of which are newer than others. Rather than bore you with every single update that brought each of these changes, I'm just going to describe them. Hopefully that will allow me to spend slightly less time perusing the wiki. Terraria is known, if for nothing else, than for its bosses. We've already discussed the game's hardest boss, Golem, but shockingly, the devs didn't think Golem was enough. The changes I'm going to focus on are a set of balancing changes made to solve common exploits used to beat bosses with minimal effort. Some of these make perfect sense, like making the Destroyer immune to all debuffs. Some are heinous, like allowing Golem to jump through blocks to chase the player, leading to the burning question, have they made Golem too hard? Good God, I wrote another Golem joke. Also, please note that this is not by any means an exhaustive list. These are just a few things that I've personally noticed and thought about. Please feel free to add your own examples in the comments. The Destroyer change that I already mentioned is a solid example of reasonable game design, even if I wish there was a better alternative than just giving the giant worm debuff immunity. When you use debuff inflicting weapons against the boss, you're given no visual indicator that the debuff worked, teaching the player that these sorts of weapons are ineffective. By contrast, let's take a look at Skeletron. The Skeletron fight heavily incentivizes the player to destroy the boss's hands before taking out the head, especially on harder difficulties. They do this primarily by giving the boss high defense until his hands have been destroyed, and making the fight significantly more dangerous if the player continues to target the head anyway. One problem with this is that there are numerous debuff-inflicting weapons that deal high enough damage per second that they're capable of bypassing the high defense and damaging the head before time is up. These weapons, the Bone Javelin, Tentacle Spike, and Blood Butcherer, have thus been rendered ineffective. Skeletron is simply immune to their debuffs. Okay, fine, but the game gives a visual indication that the weapons still work. While you'll no longer see the tiny damage indicators, the weapons still stick in Skeletron's head, meaning the main method of testing a debuff is essentially lying to you. To be clear, my issue isn't that this makes the fight too hard, it's that it disincentivizes player experimentation and kind of gives mixed signals. The easiest way to fix this would be to simply make the projectiles associated with these debuffs break on contact with his head. If we wanted to be more exciting, though, we could envision a version of Skeletron that flings the projectile back at the player during his spin attack, much like how that attack reflects most projectiles on some difficulties. I think that could be a fun way of teaching the player a lesson that would also create a memorable fight experience, though I don't know enough about game design to know if it's viable. Some more boss-related changes. Homing weapons are super effective against the lunatic cultist, and explosives are super effective against the Eater of Worlds. As a result, they just made these types of weapons deal less damage to their respective bosses, in expert mode for the Eater of Worlds particularly. While this is something you might notice if you're really doing the math on your damage output, it feels a bit cheap to simply make weapons weaker without informing the player somehow. I personally would be interested in seeing homing weapons simply miss the lunatic cultist a quarter of the time, or for it to summon duplicates that draw the player's fire. Something like that to make these attacks visibly less effective in a way that makes the boss fight more dynamic. While we're at it, make its lightning bolts inflict the electrified debuff from the Martian Madness event. Restricting the player's movement without actually slowing them down is a very interesting concept that I think the game could use more. That's not a criticism, I just have a weird appreciation for the electrified debuff. The Eater of Worlds was a bit harder for me, but I think some version of making the boss eat, diffuse, or destroy a percentage of the player's explosive weapons could maybe make for an interesting mechanic. A simple visual indicator like a shield or a unique explosive color could also work. I don't know, these are just pie-in-the-sky ideas. This is definitely a weaker criticism anyway, given the Queen Bee fight incorporates a similar mechanic, and I think it works fine in that situation. Overall, Terraria is a game that heavily incentivizes new players to experiment with new weapons, strategies, and classes, to the point that while for the most part the broader Terraria community is more wholesome than average, I almost encourage people to not participate in it until they've formed their impressions of the game for a good few months. I don't care if the Tempest staff is generally considered super lame. If you enjoy having a cloud of Sharknadoes, you shouldn't have to justify that to anyone. I don't love the Medusa's Head, but I will defend to the death your right to be a Medusa's Head main. For a while there, the Life Drain and Clinger staff had a relatively negative reputation, yet they were some of my favorite weapons. I just wouldn't want your perception of fun elements to be tainted by pure numbers and community opinion. If you have any similar critiques or examples that I missed, ideas for better fixes than I came up with, or even better, ways these critiques have made you appreciate certain other bosses, I'd love to hear all of it. One thing making this video did for me was make me realize how much more I love boss fights like Empress of Light or Deerclops for directing the player to learn patterns and dodge methods, or the Wall of Flesh for being a boss that can appear out of nowhere via accidental player input, leading to a fight that basically forces the player to have prepared beforehand. This game has far more good mechanics than bad ones, and spending time thinking about them has been a really fun experience. If you're new here and like content that analyzes random elements of different media, I'd appreciate your likes, subscribes, and illegal gun parts. I have a vague idea for a future Terraria video, but it probably won't surprise you to learn I'll be taking a break from the topic for at least a little while. But anyhow, thanks for watching, and I will see you in the previous one.